Chapter 9 is about competition and the relationship between competition and government policy. What I want to do in this video is really focus on the idea of what competition really is, and then toward the end I'll say a few words about the role of government policy. But I think as you read the chapter, you can see that most of the sort of detailed stuff in there is pretty straightforward, and I think if I can give you a framework within this lecture to sort of think about those particular laws and the history of those laws, that's really the best use of my time. So first, let's talk about what we mean by competition. As the textbook points out, most economists, when they talk about competition, start by thinking in terms of sort of competition as a kind of state of affairs. And there is this model that economists work with called the perfect competition model that makes it sound like, right, that's the ideal of what competition should be. And the problem with that perfect competition model is that it describes competition as a state of affairs, as a kind of static snapshot picture of the world in which certain things are true, and the assumptions that go into that model of perfect competition. And again, let me be clear, I think that this model is problematic, and what I want to do is talk about why it's problematic, but I want to make sure you understand it first. There's really 5 things that go into this model, 5 assumptions. One is that perfect competition is characterized by a large number of buyers and sellers, none of whom has any sort of power in the market. That's number 1. Number 2, that everyone in the market, all the market actors, possess full and complete information about all the relevant alternatives that they face. So people know everything they need to know to make their decisions. Sellers produce a homogeneous product. That means basically all the things that are being sold in a certain market are identical, right? You can think the example here would be sort of things like commodities like wheat or corn, but if this model were to apply to anything, for example, breakfast cereals, all breakfast cereals would be exactly the same. Fourth, there's costless mobility of resources. That means it's easy to move from industry to industry. And then finally, economic actors are price takers. What that means is that both buyers and sellers take the market price as given. None of them can have any influence over price. One question you might ask yourself, if everyone is a price taker, how does the price of a good ever change? Right? So again, you can begin to see why there might be problems here. Now, again, standard economics takes those assumptions and develops a model. If all those things are true, we will have perfect competition. Resources will be allocated optimally. There will be zero economic profits, right? Think back to our discussion of profits. If there's zero economic profits, what that means is nobody can do better by shifting their resources to another use, right? Nobody can move to a different job or move their machinery to a different line of production, right? Everything is as good as it can possibly be. All right, so what's the big problem with that picture of competition? As I suggested, the big problem is that it's static. It's a snapshot. It doesn't capture the way in which competition is a process. And in particular, it assumes away all of the interesting questions about the real world that are important. So for example, by assuming that everyone knows all the things, the relevant knowledge they need to know, that's just not true, right? We just, in the real world, both sellers and buyers, both producers and consumers, simply don't know all the things that they might wish they knew. And in fact, the best way to think about competition is that what's happening in a marketplace, in a competitive marketplace, is that people are trying to discover the best ways of doing things in terms of producers, and from consumers' perspective, consumers are trying to discover what the best options are out there. What are the best buys out there? What are the best products out there? What is out there that they like or do not like? So that notion of competition as a discovery procedure is really, really important. And that perfect competition model is simply too perfect in the sense that it assumes away, again, all of the interesting features of the real world. And so in particular, one that we've talked a little bit about already that's absent from that model is entrepreneurship. If we think about what entrepreneurs do in the real world, they are the ones who are seeing these opportunities where people don't understand or are lacking information. And what entrepreneurs do is to sort of close that information gap by taking resources and using them in different ways. For example, when we talked about entrepreneurs being price arbitrageurs, right? What those entrepreneurs did was to sort of make people understand that the price of one good here, they can get that good for cheaper elsewhere, right? Or that sellers can sell it for a better price elsewhere. Entrepreneurs are the source of change in the economy. They are the dynamic force that that generates the social learning that's necessary given our ignorance. Again, perfect competition is simply too perfect. Given the uncertainty of the real world, given the limits to our knowledge, we can't have that perfection, right? What we do have are people who are always looking for opportunities to improve themselves, to make a better product, to sell that product profitably, right? You think about our example of the grocery store lines that the book talks about, we've talked about before, right? You get in the long line, you see, in fact, I was at IKEA yesterday, got in one line, noticed that there was a couple people in front of me that had really big orders, like, presumably building a house from IKEA parts, right? And I immediately shifted over to the line next to me on the assumption that line would move more quickly, which it did, right? So we see these opportunities, right, to reallocate resources, in this case, me and my time, right? To better coordinate our plans with each other, right? I didn't know for sure that I was going to be right in moving lines. Turns out I was right. But that sort of competitive, what we might call rivalrous behavior, always searching for better and better opportunities, right, is the key to how markets work. Economics should not be about describing perfectly coordinated plans, but instead what we want to do is describe how it is that plans get better and better coordinated, right? And what competition does is to better and better coordinate our plans. That model of perfect competition eliminates competition, the rivalrous competition as we know it in the real world. So when I say the word competition, right, if I say what's the behavior that firms engage in that you think of as being competitive, what comes to mind, right? I think about what sorts of behavior firms engage in. Certainly price cutting, right, for one thing. Advertising is a form of competition. Convincing, or having a product that you think is different and better than what your competition has. All of those are ways of engaging in this rivalry of competition, right? And what we think of as being sort of part of real world competition. But notice, you can't do any of those in that model, right? You can't cut your price. You have no power over price. You can't differentiate your product. You can't make it different. Why would you advertise? Everything's the same and everybody knows everything. In the real world, though, all of these things are part of the model of competition. And notice in the real world, too, it doesn't have to be a large number of firms for there to be very vigorous competition. Coke and Pepsi, right, two dominant firms in that market, very competitive with each other. Think about cell phone companies, right, Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile. It's not a large number of firms. The firms are all big, very, very competitive with each other. Same with things like the competition between DirecTV and the cable companies, right? They're big companies, and there's few of them, but very, very competitive in trying to always improve their products, trying to persuade you to buy them for whatever reason. So again, one way to think about what's happening here is that firms are engaged in this process of discovery. And it's not just about discovering what the best price to charge is, right? When we were looking at our friend Ed Syke and the campus movie, we were really focused on, all right, what price and quantity should charge. But here the question is, should he be, what should the product look like, right? What are the features of the product? Should you think about the market for smartphones? Should it have a camera? Of course it does now. Should it be able to, what sorts of things should it be able to do? What size should it be, right? How connected to other kinds of apps or other kinds of hardware should it be, right? Right? What sort of screen resolution, camera in front, camera in back, right? All these differences that we might think about between different kinds of goods are the ways in which manufacturers try to figure out what it is that people want. You can think of the competition in the fast food and the sort of upper end fast food industry. Again, what is it that people want here? What kinds of products? Right? How well do they work? Firms go out of business because they've guessed wrong, right? They've been wrong. They haven't been able to discover. Quiznos Subs has pretty much disappeared because they couldn't keep up with the competition from Jimmy John's or other kinds of places as well. So we see firms going out of business is part and parcel of that competitive process. One of the ways to think about this is to analogize it to athletic competition. I like sports analogies all the time, and the same is true with many of the same things that are true with economic competition, right? Why do we play the game? We're going to have the Super Bowl shortly, right? Why do we play the Super Bowl? We play to find out which team is better. If we knew for a fact which team was better, if we knew Brady and the Patriots can't be beat, right? Why play the game? The fact is we don't know. And upsets in sports, right, tell us that we just don't know ahead of time. And the way we find out who the better team is on any given day is to play the game. Athletic competition is a process of discovery by which we find out, at least in that time and context, who the better player or who the better team is. So those sports analogies, I think, are really important. And thinking about how firms compete, right, by trying to outdo each other. Again, not just on price, but of the features of their products. Another example is Raisin Bran cereals. They're all a little bit different, right? Kellogg's Raisin Bran is more sugary, Post Raisin Bran less sugary, Total Raisin Bran is healthier for you, right? They're all Raisin Brans, but they're all a little bit different. Again, trying to figure out exactly what it is that customers want. So when we think about government policy with respect to competition, right, well, one of the things we have to realize is that government policymakers, members of Congress and bureaucrats, are also ignorant of those outcomes. They don't know what the right price should be. They don't know what the right number of firms in the industry should be. They don't know what the right size should be. They are no better positioned to know that than economists are. We don't know. That's why we have competition. That's why we let firms pursue the paths that they want to pursue as long as they're engaged within the sort of rule of law, contracts respecting property rights, all those kind of things. If two big firms want to merge, let them merge. We don't know if that's too big or too small, if it's going to work, it's going to not. Sometimes those big mergers have worked, sometimes they don't, right? One of the problems with antitrust laws you'll read about in the chapter is that it presumes to know what the right number of firms and right size of firms in the market is. One of the problems firms face all the time, right, is if that antitrust law and other regulatory law can charge them can charge them with charging too high of a price, right? Saying they're trying to monopolize the industry and they're charging the price too high. Can also charge them with charging too low a price. They're dumping their goods or they're engaged in predatory pricing, something you'll read about in the chapter. But how do regulators, how do bureaucrats, how do politicians know what the right price is? They don't. The only way we know what the right price is to allow firms to compete in the marketplace and figure that out. So as we've talked about in other instances this semester, right, one of the things that markets do is to teach us, right? Markets are social learning processes. They help us to figure out what the size of firms should be, what kinds of products they should sell, what price they should charge, how many firms there should be, how much should they advertise. None of that is things we can know ahead of time. So if you stop and think for a minute, right, you're driving through a major sort of urban or suburban area, and you come to a big intersection, and you look, and on every corner of that intersection, there's a gas station. And you might think to yourself for a moment, right, why do we need a gas station on every corner? Why four corners with gas stations? Isn't that wasteful, right, to have gas stations in every corner? But if you take the perspective that I've just outlined, right, we ask a different question, which is, how do we know what the right number of gas station is? And better yet, how do we know which gas station should be there, which should? And how do we know what they should offer? Should they have a convenience store? Should they have a car wash? Right? Should they have attendants, serving you? Should they do repairs? Right? There's all kinds of ways in which those products will be different. What price? We don't know. Right? So all of those things are different. And what we're seeing with that competition, same as with multiple, say, shoe stores at the mall, right? All of those things are competition. All of those things are the rivalry of the marketplace, of entrepreneurs trying to figure out what it is that people want and using the profit and loss system as a way to guide their behavior. That's what competition is. It isn't this sort of static, quiet, everything is perfect idea, but rather it's really that rough and tumble of the discovery process of the marketplace as we try to figure out, again, what it is that people want and how best to make it. And the best thing that public policy can do is to leave markets to engage in that discovery process within the rule of law and let people figure out and learn the kinds of information that is not possible for bureaucrats and politicians and regulators to possess. So when we look at those government policies with respect to competition, we should be skeptical that they're really promoting competition. And instead we might ask, who's really benefiting from those laws? And as we'll take a look a little bit in this chapter and certainly later on in chapter 11, we'll get a better sense of asking that kind of question about what's really happening with laws that don't seem to work to improve the well-being of consumers and citizens, yet nonetheless might be working to improve the well-being of select interest groups or select producers. One of the things about government policy is it often protects competitors, not competition. So as you read through this chapter and as you do the other things in this section of the course, keep all of that in mind.